Hello and welcome to Shadowverse Down Under. This is the first episode brought to you by Sonar 5 Beamer, and it'll actually act as a pilot episode to kind of gauge the feedback and see what you guys might be interested in. And so the first topic of discussion will actually be on the pre-rage meta review. So of course I think it's actually ongoing as I record this video, so we can review it later on and we can see whether or not some of my meta predictions were accurate or not. So to start things off, I just give a brief introduction about myself. So I'm known as S5 Be My Young Cat. I'm an Australian. I started playing the game in 2018, and I'm the team leader of Team Sonar 5, which is one of the top Western teams. As you might have imagined, Young Cat is my favorite card, and I do go by a number of different names, such as Shadowverse Open Criminal, Challenge Master, and among others. So, in terms of the achievements I've had, I have attended every single Contenders Cup since I started playing. And also in 2021, which was last year, I finally managed to qualify to the World Grand Prix, where I was just one game away from making the top 4, which would be like the top 8 overall. I think the main thing to note is that this year pretty much is a bit of an off season for a lot of the competitive players because there's no World Grand Prix kind of qualification opportunity. So I mean that's one of the reasons why I wanted to kind of develop some content and see what might be helpful to the community, giving a little bit back. So without further ado, I will jump into the discussion around the Tier 1 decks. So these are the ones which I think you're going to see a lot of. They're the most likely to see success. It doesn't necessarily reflect what I think are the strongest decks. So the first deck is obviously Dirt Rune. I think you can't really debate it. It's definitely Tier 1. It is the highest popularity deck. It has the most tournament wins. But I do think that tournament performance is starting to decline. And what I mean by that is obviously the popularity has remained the same, but I think the performance, like in terms of conversion rate, in terms of like the number of deep runs, aside from championship wins, is slowly decreasing, and I think that will continue to happen. The deck lists are mostly refined. They are roughly the same 38 to 40 cards. The only real difference is usually the Pursuer Golem and Jubilant Switch, and it really just depends on what kind of decks you want to target, essentially. But for the most part, you're going to see the same 38 cards like pretty much every time. I think it has a reasonably good matchup spread and a flexible game plan. So what that means is, depending on what you draw, you can either go aggro, or you can save up, like in a control deck-ish style, and try to OTK them in one turn. And that flexibility is why a lot of people really like playing this deck, and it does give people an opportunity to use their skill expression to win the game. Now, I will say it does have a few heavy weaknesses. Like the main one that comes to mind is probably Control Forest. When they pilot it correctly and they don't brick, it is really difficult to win because they go above 20 HP and they have healing. So it's quite common that they can literally stall you out until Gilnoise comes out and the game's over. Personally, I think this deck will drop in popularity and success over time. I think it's a little bit overrated, but nevertheless, it is going to keep topping. It is going to keep being played in tournaments, but I think other decks will eventually rise up to take up some of that popularity. Now, Portalcraft, it was, in my opinion, the best deck pre-nerf, and just to clarify, this is the version with Flame and Glass and Craftsman's Pride and Xion. If your deck wasn't running these, then it probably wasn't broken, right? So just make sure you have that distinction in mind. So, I mean, for example, if you're like, well, I played it, but you didn't run those cards, then you weren't playing the real Resonance Portal at the time. Now, despite the nerfs, the deck has consistently remained high win rate and high play rate and ratings. And over the past week, I would say, the tournament performance has started to reflect that as well. So I think, given a bit more time, this deck will climb to at least top 2, if not the best deck. Class, I should say, because actually, I wouldn't say that it's one specific deck within Portal. I mean, they run very similarly, right? But actually, Flame and Glass, Bahamut, Puppet, Mecha, like all of those are actually all strong. And I don't think people have really figured out the optimal yet. I suspect it will be Resonance, but we'll wait and see. And the reason why this deck is so good is because basically the Kisim engine shuts down aggro really hard, which is why, Handless has a difficult time, for instance. And some, board-based decks have issues, right? And on top of that, it has Wielder of the Cosmos to deal with control decks. So it actually covers both ends of the spectrum. And then on top of that, it's actually fine against Dirt Rune as well. Like, you can tempo versus him. And if you drop Xion at the right timing, to be honest, anytime you drop Xion, you're pretty much guaranteed not to lose the next turn, right? But if they can't answer it, it's GG right there. And that is because you have the option to, either buff it, or alternatively, you have the option to heal it using Rosa, for instance. Like, if they can't answer it, they're just not going to be able to answer it. And half the time, to answer it, either they need an Evo point, or they need to use, the Superior Conductor to clear it. And that is not ideal. So, in my opinion, this deck might actually turn out to be the best deck of the format, even post-nerf. We'll wait and see, obviously. I mean, it's a bit of a knee-jerk reaction to say it is, so at this point, but it is trending towards that general direction. So, Flame and Glass Shadow, so this did affect the deck's overall strength a little bit, not by much, to be honest, because most of the matchups doesn't really matter if you have one extra damage on Flame and Glass, because of just how much perk damage is in the deck. So Spirit Invasion, Corral Souls, like this is unavoidable damage almost. And unless you're playing a deck like Control Forest or Control Haven or something like that, it really just doesn't matter, because these decks in the meta just don't have that much healing in the first place. So you don't even need to do 20 OTK damage, is the point. Now, I will say, the main draw for this deck is that it does have a good matchup spread. It doesn't have any real hard counters. So, for example, how Handless Blood and Dirt Rune have a difficult matchup against Control Forest. This deck doesn't have that. Ironically, it's actually really good against Control Forest. It is definitely going to remain as one of the best decks in meta because it has a high skill cap and it's very flexible. Can be run in a lot of lineups. There's not much variation. I mean, the only difference you'll really see is Wayfaring Goblin. Some people will run that, some people won't. And then maybe the number of Ruler 9 copies. But to be honest, you're not going to see much change because it already is pretty much refined from previous expansions, and some guy getting a 30 win streak at the start of the season. Okay, and then is this the last deck? Control Forest and Journey Forest. So Control Forest is one of the decks which has the most lopsided matchup spread. So what I mean by that is there are some matchups where you just straight up can't win, and there are some matchups where you're okay, this is pretty free. If I run into it, so for example, it is very, very good against Dirt Rune, because basically you increase your max HP cap above 20, heal up any damage they have, you answer any board they play. Most of the time you're going to succeed, which makes it a pretty favored matchup in my opinion. On the other hand, you've got matchups like Flame and Glass Shadow where your only hope is to just drop Baja and then pray they don't have the OTK in hand already, and so, I mean, it's such a scuffed plan, to be honest. You're inherently unfavored in that matchup, and to be honest, it doesn't really matter how much your max HP is increased to. It's not like with Dirt Rune where it's hard capped 22 or something like that. I mean, this matchup is dreadful, to be honest. So, there is an alternative build, so I'll move my camera a little bit. So, Mura from a pro team, I think it's SHG, could be wrong. But he brought this to the Rage Pro League, and it's basically a build which aims to OTK the opponent with Mammoth and Fairy Tail Prince. So if you have 2 Mammoth in hand and you drop Fairy Tail Prince, pretty much always an OTK, especially if your opponent has a board. And so this change really allows you to leverage your really strong mid-game tempo with Blossoming Lunarian, where you are going to get some poke every once in a while, and actually be able to close it out. So it makes the deck, or the matchup spread, worse against Dirt, for instance, but it's a lot better against decks like Sword, Flame and Glass Shadow, Spellboost Rune, for instance, because these are decks which originally they were just, they don't really care if you drop Baja, and then you can't really store them out because they'll just kill you, right? But in this situation, all of that changes because now you have the option to just drop them from 20 to 0 or 10 to 0, however much damage you've actually managed to land on them. So that is the main attraction for this deck. I think it's fairly good. I kind of love them together because honestly they play almost exactly the same in the early mid. The main difference is like, if you were to explain it, it's more like you might have some dead cards in hand in the mid game. So Mammoth is pretty much a dead card. And then maybe Ferroton Prince is like a bit of a dead card. So you have less options in the mid game, but then your late game is like generally better. Okay, moving on. So tier 2 decks. So these are all decks which are, in my opinion, really strong, but have a kind of lowish play rate. I know that Barrow Shadow is probably not really tier 2, it's probably more like tier 3, but I wanted to chuck it in here because I think it's the ladder deck that has the most potential of being good. So just throwing it in there, I think it is tier 2, like from a personal perspective, but I know objectively it's probably not. First deck, so Sword. I think this is really sleeper at the moment. Like, the main reason why I think this deck wasn't being played very much is because of how badly Resonance Portal pre-nerf destroyed it. So essentially, like, they drop Kasim early. You might not even have an answer to Kasim. Even if you do have an answer, by then you've already taken like 10 damage. And then, you finally stabilize, you're going to turn 7, and then you're Flame Glass and OTK. Like, you can't do anything against that, right? So it's only because of that nerf that this deck is going to come back into the meta. So people have started to realize the play rate is increasing, win rate has been high, there's both tournaments and ratings. So in my opinion, it has a good matchup spread against most of the meta decks in the moment because it has that mid-game resilience and the OTK potential from turn 8 onwards. I did also make top 16 of the most recent JCG with this, so I could be a little bit biased, but to be honest, the only reason I brought Sword is because I saw this data and I thought, hey, I really should give this a try, and I was like pleasantly surprised. So, the more you know. I think the main takeaway with Sword is that basically it is one of those decks where it feels balanced, I guess. Like, as in, apart from ramping on Ramio on turn 4 into like Chromatic Duel, which is insane, and most decks can't deal with that. The main thing is, like, it's usually dependent on how hard your opponent high rolls you, as opposed to how hard you high roll them. So what that means is essentially, like, you're a bit of a stat check deck in a sense, because if they don't draw well enough, like, you're going to be able to answer them, and then eventually you snowball kind of that lead. And in my opinion, you actually win that stat check more often than not, and that's why I think Sword is a good deck. But over a large sample size, like maybe a small sample size, sometimes you'll just get blown out by variance, and that is just how this deck is. Okay, moving on. So Handless Blood. I really hate this deck. I really wish it wasn't a part of the meta, but unfortunately it is. It's dreadful to play against. A lot of the time it's like, oh, did I draw the answer? Oh, I didn't. Game's over in 5 turns. Like, a lot of the time, like, you'll know that the game is over on like the 3rd or 4th turn, which is so ridiculous. I mean, anyway, I won't rant on Handless Blood too much, but he does have a lopsided matchup spread against decks like Portal and Sea Forest. Sea Forest obviously a lot of healing. Portal has a lot of like taunts, like pseudo taunts. Like, you can't ignore Rosa, you can't ignore Yuan, you can't ignore Kasim, and then they've got Wards, and they've got Birth of the Ravenous, which shuts down your entire game plan. So these are not great matchups, and but the main driving point to run this deck is because it has a good matchup against Dirt Rune. I think it is probably favored against Dirt Rune, but Dirt Rune has ways to win anyways. Anyway, I think you can bring this deck as part of a lineup that tries to target Dirt Rune, but then you run into the risk of running into lineups without Dirt Rune. And so, like, in my opinion, if you bring this deck into a deck 0 ban, you are a bit of a gambling addict. But deck's not bad. And its tournament performance has been fine, even though it hasn't won anything recently because, of the state of the meta. Okay, so the next one is Spellboost Rune. So I think this deck is really strong when it's piloted by a skillful player. It's very good versus slow decks. But Portal's Resurgence, despite being a bit of a slow deck, you can say, really shuts us down because Divine Weapon going to your Kuon OTK, you can't do anything. And also, even if you do drop Kuon, and it's a 10-10 or whatever, and they can't answer it, doesn't really matter because its damage is capped, and they'll eventually be able to clear it anyway. Also, I think the deck is surprisingly good against Dirt Rune. For example, you can drop Kuon on turn 7 with Elements of Creation, and they probably might not have like the OTK, or you can just sub win con, so you can go turn 7 Elements of Creation into turn 8 Elements of Creation. In some cases, they literally just will not have 20 damage in hand, and this will be most likely when they don't draw like multiple Levi in the early game. Like if you add up like the numbers, if they have like a Sigil and they have like 4 followers, each with like 3 attack, right? So that's 12 damage plus like Evo, so 14, and then like plus like 1 Levi spell, like that's 17 damage, right? So potentially like you can just board lock them into lethal. So anyway, I think Spellboost Rune would be like a really good deck if it went for Portal. I would actually put it as tier 1, but I think unfortunately the meta development will hinder the success of this deck. On top of it being unpopular in the first place compared to Dirt Rune. Okay. Next deck is Mono Blood, so it's a fairly powerful deck with a dedicated player base. I haven't played it that much in this expansion, I'll be honest. I played a lot of it last expansion. So take what I say with a grain of salt. But from what I could tell from the deck, it really depends heavily on what you draw. Like the game plan itself will change from game to game, and some games just hit 5 Evos and you just try to burn them, and then other games you just go for the OTK, right? But the problem with this deck, in my opinion, is that you are heavily dependent on drawing your Vengeance triggers, and you only run 3 copies, like, unless you run the 6 cost, but a lot of the decks don't run the 6 cost. So what that means is that like against a lot of the meta decks, like they just won't drop you below Vengeance, and then they'll OTK you in 1 turn. So I think that's probably the main issue with this deck at the moment. It can be a bit inconsistent. It really loses to itself at times. But I recommend you look at Zif's video because he did top 16 JCG with it, and I think he put out like a pretty detailed guide. So recommend looking at that if you are interested in this deck. Would not be surprised to see Outrage though. And then the final deck is Burial Shadow. So as I mentioned earlier, this deck has no competitive success. However, it's very good on ladder. It's played by the rank 1 player, and I think it actually has a bit of a skill cap attached to it, so that could explain it. But potentially what this is it's a Wrathblood situation. So as all of you know, Wrathblood is fairly popular and good on ladder, but it has no competitive success because it's not good in the meta, and when people get better at the game, they don't run into the same pitfalls. So yeah, it could be that, or it could actually be Sleepo. I mean, it's probably tier 3, but praying that it's not. Cool. So I'm going to quickly run through this section. So I think a lot of people don't really know how to look at ratings or JCG results properly. And so I won't go into too much detail, but I will go and cover the key points, right? So the first one is like, was Resonance Portal the best deck pre-nerf? So you've got a lot of people that say like, oh, Dirt Rune was potentially better than Resonance Portal, and that's full of shit. And I'll explain why. Like, first of all, people will say like, oh, Dirt Rune won 3 JCGs before the nerf, and Resonance Portal won 0. Okay, now here's why that argument is like really messed up, because the deck that was overpowered, right, was a deck that was running Xion and Craftsman's Pride. So if you are running these cards, like if you weren't running these cards pre-nerf, you weren't running the broken deck that everyone was complaining about, okay? That's the first thing. And so if you look at the JCG before the broken build, right? So this was the one where one person topped, right? I think it was Beta, a pro player, very strong player, right? He was the only one to top, and look at the average cards played, 0.38 Xion, and I had a look at the document from Zif, and I think nobody played Craftsman's Pride at all, right? So if you're not running these 2 cards, this deck isn't anywhere near as good, right? Now, you look at the JCG after the broken build with 40 win streak came out, and pretty much, out of 149 players, everyone, like on average, is running Craftsman's Pride and Xion now. So like this deck is actually now good, right? Like, so essentially there was only one JCG. There was only one where Resonance Portal was actually played. So you're comparing like apples to oranges here, because like you're saying, oh, Dirt Rune won 3. Yeah, okay, but Resonance Portal wasn't in 2 of them. So Like that's like the first thing where like people are very disingenuous with like the argument. And also I will mention like look at how many people are in the top 16 with this deck, right? And look at how many people brought it, and the conversion rate is still 7.38%. Like you want to look at a broken deck, like this is what it looks like. It's not as broken as like maybe some of the other decks you've seen like Jadalint or Latica, but in the context of the current meta, this is what a broken deck looks like. Just look at Dirt Rune after the nerf. It also has a similar amount of people bringing it, 150-ish, but the conversion rate is like 6 or 5%. Like, and this is a first tournament. Like, people only had like a day to practice this, and it was already at 7% conversion rate. It would only get better over time, guys. It doesn't have weaknesses, or it didn't have weaknesses, is what I would like to say. I mean, you've got some people who say like, oh, Control Forest, like, beat Resonance. No, like, it only beat bad players because, I mean, for instance, like, how many of you know, like, the way to beat Control Forest is if you drop Flaming Glass in turn 7 with double Fuse, plus Xion, and a pre-evo Xion, like, you automatically win against Control Forest. How many people knew that, right? Maybe you did, but I'm pretty sure a majority of people didn't. And when people figure that out, like, yeah, it's not going to have counters, guys. And by the way, that's how you beat every control deck with this deck, because pretty much nothing can clear Xion. And if you can't clear Xion, they heal it up with Rosa, and then they buff it +4/+4 with the Forged Weaponry. Like, it's insane, guys. It's freaking broken. So, let's also look at the ratings data before the nerf and the day after the nerf, right? So, look, 58% play rate and 55% win rate. 55% win rate is insane, guys. Like, it's ridiculous for this play rate. You don't see it very often with this high of a play rate. And if you need any indication, right, if you look at the other days for Dirt Rune, right, or Runecraft as a whole, 66% play rate, 50% win rate, etc., etc. Like, it's struggling. I don't think it's ever broken 52% win rate. Like, over the past 7 days, it has never broken 50% win rate, guys. And on top of that, like, you look at the win rate of Rune before, like, the nerf, right? 48% win rate with, like, an actual play rate, like 32% play rate, right? Like, Omega Law, like, how can you possibly argue that Dirt Rune was in the same level? I mean, you have people like, I don't know, Essie or something, like, I think he said Dirt Rune was tier 0, but, like, I mean, what the fuck has he done in JCG? Like, if it's really, like, that good, right? Look, obviously, I'll admit that that's not the best, like, comparison point, because he might get imposted by his other deck, but, I mean, like, the person who says that, like, the deck is tier 0 is probably playing the deck very well, and so you would assume that he'll be able to translate that to some level of success in this meta, and I don't think he has. And apart from that, like, I don't think I've seen anyone who's like who said like Dirt Rune was better than Resonance Portal, which is yeah. Anyway, I don't think I need to harp on the point. I think most people kind of know. Like, just you look at the win rate, play rate, win streaks, everything. There's no way that Resonance Portal wasn't the best deck. And also post nerf, like, you look at the meta, and like, yeah, sure, Dirt Rune is really strong, but the win rate's not out of line. Play rate might be a bit out of line, to be honest, but nothing different from Flaming Glass Shadow, past expansions. Look, I won't harp on it now. I will go through like the key points of ratings. So the first thing is Forest win rate. It is typically below 50%. I think only one day it's been 50% or higher, maybe 2 at the most. Reason behind that is because Shadow just crushes it, and it's the second highest play rate deck. So that's pretty much why. Swordcraft. This is a really interesting one, because if you're following ratings, you would know that Sword is actually pretty strong. So, 54% win rate, 51%. So you will know that, like, obviously the play rate is quite low, so it's a bit skewed by people who, like, are Sword mains or whatever, right? But if you're a Sword main, like, even if you are Sword main, right, you can't get an above 50% win rate if the deck is just bad, right? You see that with Dragon pretty much. Like, it's consistently like 30 to 40% win rate, because even if you're a Dragon main, you can't make the deck work if the deck is fundamentally too bad at the game, right? But you actually look at this, and so it only had one day, I think, below 50% win rate, and then you look at this, and like the play rate has been increasing now, and the win rate has also been increasing, and that's how you know that Sword is actually a pretty good class, and I think people are catching on. And as I said before, it's the reason why I caught on and started playing Sword, and then found out it was good. Runecraft, so I mean, this split between Spellboost and Dirt. I don't think Dirt would drag down the win rate, to be honest. I don't think Spellboost would be played that much anyway. Like, it's probably only like 1/5 of the amount of Rune players at the most. And yes, I don't think it would skew much. You can just take this as roughly Dirt Rune, I think. And like I said before, the win rate's nothing out of the ordinary. It's a strong tier 1 deck. If it's got this much of play rate and it's above 50%, obviously it's good. Like, I'm not saying it's bad. Okay, Dragon, worst class in the game. I think it's getting trolled by Bahamut builds a little bit. I think actually the Storm build is not that bad. And it's definitely good enough to win on ladder. Definitely could do with a few buffs, but like I don't really like Dragon as class that much. Of course I played in tournaments, but I really hate like when turn to Oracle or Megalol, like Jesus Christ. Okay, and then Shadow, like this deck, generally the second most popular at the moment. Like I said before, it has no real bad matchups. Like, it's a bit unfavored into Dirt Rune, I think, but because it's good against everything else, like, in my opinion, that's why this deck sees a lot of play and continues to have a high win rate. I think, actually, if you look at it properly, it's probably had a comparable, if not better, performance overall to Dirt Rune, but hey, whatever. Bloodcraft, pretty much useless information. You can't really make any decisive calls with Rating Starter because there's too many archetypes with Blood that people play. There's Evo, Wrath, Handless, like I think there's another one, a Mono, so like there's 4 archetypes, you can't tell which one's which. So like whatever the number is, like yeah, you can make an assumption it's Handless, but I mean, I don't think like you should really rely on Rating Starter for Blood. And then Haven has a similar problem, so like there is a decent split between Ward Haven and Control Haven. So like I mean I think there are only 2 archetypes really, right, at the moment. So you can kind of like use a starter a little bit because you can just test both decks and get like a view, but overall Haven, like it doesn't really tell you much. It's kind of similar to Sword to an extent where like the deck has had like a pretty decent performance, all things considered, in ratings, and I think if I had to wager a guess, it is probably Ward Haven that is performing the best out of the 2. Just based on tournament data as well. And the last deck is actually Portal. So I think like apart from the day after the nerf where like the play rate and the win rate dropped, and then the play rate continued to drop, right? I think what people realized over time is that the win rate just wasn't dropping like properly. So like I think it was from July 10th onwards, that is when people like started to figure it out. Like they were like, hey, wait a second, the win rate is actually like stabilized above 50%, and then this day here is when people were like, hold on a moment, like, hey, this deck is actually still good, and so that's when 7% more people start playing it, and the win rate barely dropped, and it keeps going up. And I will have to say, once again, there are so many archetypes within Portal that like all you know is that Portal's win rate is going up. You don't know which build, like you don't know what deck list is actually like causing these shifts, right? And on top of that, I think like generally speaking, a lot of the Portal classes are viable or good because of the fundamental like kind of stable cards that they run. So I think this is one of those interesting things where if you are following kind of the ratings data, you can get a glimpse. Like you could predict quite easily that Portalcraft was going to rise up, and it did in the latest JCG. So jumping ahead a little bit, so in this 5th JCG, 13% conversion rate, 7 people in the top 16, 3 people in the top 4, winner was Resonance Portal. I mean, you're going to see more and more of this, guys. This deck is really good. Probably, like, it's very likely that it will become the best deck of the format. Otherwise, it would just be Dirt Rune, obviously. But what does that say? Like, as in terms of whether or not the nerf was deserved, that the deck can be nerfed that hard and still end up being potentially the best deck of the format. I mean, if you nerfed Dirt Rune, that deck would just be out. You know what I mean? So, yeah, just consider that next time we talk about the nerf. Now, I will briefly kind of run through like the key points. So, I think the first JCG, I think it was like on the day of the nerf or the day after. So it doesn't really mean that much. As you expect, Dirt Rune and FG Shadow were already optimized, so you didn't even need to change the cards. Of course they're going to do well, guys, and they keep doing well, like they keep winning. I think Spellboost winning this JCG was no surprise. Portal wasn't that popular in this particular JCG, and on top of that, beats every control deck. I think the actual winner faced against 2 Evo Forest lineups, And like, Spellboost isn't even bad against Dirt Rune. I think it's like actually like even probably. And then it's good against Flame and Glass Shadow. There's no retracing the past, so there's no way to like stop the turn 8 lethal. And on top of that, you still have your general shenanigans like turn 7 Kuon creation, stuff like that. Yeah, overall, it's not surprising to me that Spellboost won. It is like actually a really strong deck. And then I guess if you keep going through like the data, like Resonance Portal is like the thing that I would tell you to kind of keep an eye out on, because like you look at this and it's like this one was pretty bad, like because it's first JCG, but then afterwards 9, 8%, 8%, 11%, 13%, doesn't even matter what build it is apparently, right? It's consistently really good. And then this JCG 13% with 52 people playing it. I mean, yeah. Very strong. Other thing to mention is that Rally Sword. So like based on the like data and ratings, like people actually seeing success on ladder as well. That is when kind of you see people starting to bring it and realizing it's quite good. So I think that is kind of the main talking points for this video. I do welcome my kind of feedback in relation to this. I will mention that my computer doesn't have Microsoft PowerPoint, so of course the slides are going to be a little bit scuffed, so don't give me too much feedback on that because I already know. But let me know if like this type of conversation topic that you guys find interesting. I might do some more in the future, depending on how I'm feeling. Cheers.